Hey friends, welcome in. Tonight, we're not just flipping open a history book, we're slicing through it. Page by page, year by year, into the kind of moments your high school teacher probably sped past in a PowerPoint full of bad fonts and worse pronunciations. We're talking about the battles they don't make movies about. The ones where there's no heroic charge, no perfect soundtrack, and half the people involved didn't even realize they were about to rewrite the course of human history. Battles that looked boring on paper and changed everything. From Persian arrows darkening the sky at Marathon, to cannon smoke over French mud at Castillon, to one very awkward corporate bribe in a Bengali rice field, these are stories not of grandeur, but of miscommunications. Monsoons, egos, accidents, and 6-minute disasters with world-sized consequences. This isn't a lecture, it's a story, messy, human, and full of the weird, wild, and uncomfortable truths history likes to hide behind marble statues and movie scripts. So before we dive in, if you like tumbling into rabbit holes as much as I do, give this video a like, and maybe hit subscribe, but only if you're into stories that smell like smoke, sweat, and scandal. Drop a comment with where you're watching from, and what time. It is always cool to see who else is crawling out of the algorithm with us tonight. Now, grab a blanket, dim the lights, maybe start a fan for a little background doom, and let's take a breath together before the plunge. You're not just hearing history, you're waking up in it. Chapter 1. The Battle of Marathon, the jog that saved democracy. The wind smelled like goat dung and salt. It was late summer in the year 490 BCE, and along the quiet curve of the Marathon Plain, east of Athens, the sea foamed lazily at the edges of an empire's ambition. The ships had arrived, like floating beetles, hundreds of them, Persian transports stretching along the shore. From them poured an army, archers in scale armour, horsemen with recurved bows, infantry bearing the symbol of the King of Kings, Darius I, 25,000, maybe more. Some said 40. Not that anyone in Athens was doing the math. When the largest empire the world had ever seen parks itself on your doorstep, the exact number becomes less important than the fact that you're completely, undeniably, and inescapably doomed. The Persians had come for punishment. A few years earlier, Athens had supported a revolt in Ionia, stirring up trouble in Persian territory, like a drunk neighbour throwing rocks at an empire's windows. Darius had taken it personally. Athens would pay. And now, with the help of a former Athenian tyrant's son, Hippiashu had aged badly, and now wore the reek of desperation, like cheap perfumey Persians, had landed on Greek soil, intent on crushing the tiny, unruly city-state into the dust. Back in Athens, panic had not quite reached full boil, but it was close. Some argued for surrender, others wanted to negotiate, a few talked of evacuation. But a core of determined men soldiers, farmers, craftsmen, philosophers who had trained with shield and spear marched to meet the Persians on the plain. Just over 0 of them, citizens of Athens, joined by a few thousand from Plataea, a small ally with a big heart. No Spartans, not yet. The Spartans, in the most wonderfully Greek excuse ever, were observing a religious festival and could not march until the next full moon. Translation: they'd get there when they got there. So it was left to Athens, just Athens, a city barely a century into its strange experiment with self-government. A place where cobblers could vote, where arguments happened in amphitheatres, where men praised wisdom but still believed thunder came from angry gods. Their army wasn't professional, it was personal. These weren't mercenaries. They were citizen shoplightsmen who fought not for gold or glory, but because, simply, it was their home, their homes, their olive trees, their children, their gods. They camped above the Marathon Plain for days, watching the Persians assemble in glittering ranks. Debate raged. Should they wait? Hold the high ground? Try diplomacy? But one man, Miltiades, the general with the stare of a man who'd been too close to the fire before, pressed for attack. He knew the Persians. He'd served in their army once. He knew their weaknesses, and Athens didn't have time for strategy. If the Persians broke through to the city, the unarmed citizens there would be helpless. And so, on the morning that the sea mist still clung to the grass and the Persian drums echoed across the plain, the Athenians made their move. They ran. That's the part most people forget. The hoplites ran. Fully armoured, shields clashing, sandals beating against dry earth, they sprinted the final distance to the enemy, linear mad, desperate charge across almost a mile of open ground. The Persians didn't expect it. They thought the Greeks would hold their ground, let themselves be picked off by archers. They didn't understand the madness of a citizen army defending its own soil. Spears lowered, shields locked, the collision was thunder. It wasn't elegant. Hoplite warfare rarely was. No flanking manoeuvres, no graceful cavalry charges. Just two walls of men slamming into each other, shield to shield, foot to foot, sweat and fear and the smell of iron. The Athenians had thinned their centre and reinforced their flanks a risky move. The middle sagged, but it didn't break, and the wings curled inward like a door slamming shut. The Persians were trapped, enveloped, cut down in the thousands. Some drowned in the nearby marshes, their armour dragging them into the mud. Others tried to flee to the ships. A few made it, most did not. When the dust cleared, over 0 Persian bodies littered the plain. The Athenians had lost 192, a number still remembered, a number carved into stone and memory. The runner didn't die. That's another myth. You've heard the story. A lone man, Phidippides, sprints the 26 miles to Athens, gasps out, "Nike victory," and drops dead on the spot. It's cinematic. It's poetic. It's fake. Phidippides did run before the battle. From Athens to Sparta, almost 140 miles, to ask for help. The Spartans said no, politely, with lots of prayers and apologies, so he ran back. After the battle, someone, maybe him, maybe another, ran to Athens to announce the win, but there's no record of a dramatic collapse. We just like the story better with a corpse at the finish line. The real victory was quieter. After the fighting, the Athenians returned home, marching in silence. The Persians, stunned and humiliated, sailed away. They would be back, of course, with more men, more ships, but for a moment just one the impossible had happened. The world's most powerful empire had been stopped, not by a king, not by divine intervention, but by farmers and potters and philosophers in armour, men who argued about the nature of justice in the agora and then stood shoulder to shoulder when justice demanded blood. At the time, no one called it a turning point. There were no fireworks, no declarations, just the wind over the empty plain and the vultures circling, yet history turned, quietly, subtly. Had the Persians won at Marathon, Athens might have fallen. Democracy might have died in its infancy. Philosophy, art, the very idea of the individuals nuffed out like a candle. It's impossible to know what was truly saved on that field, but we can guess. This wasn't a heroic cavalry charge or a tale of tactical brilliance. It was a hard, fast, brutal fight between people who had nowhere else to go. Marathon was, if anything, a study in committed desperation. The men who fought there didn't seek greatness. They just refused to be slaves. Later generations would mythologize it, paintings, statues, nationalistic speeches. But in the moment it was simpler. The Athenians stood because they had to, because their city was theirs, and no one, no, even Darius, was going to take it without a fight. You might be wondering what makes this battle important, After all, it was small, forgotten by many, overshadowed by later, grander clashes. But this was the first time free men stood against an empire and didn't blink. That matters. The idea that people could govern themselves, defend themselves, and chart their own course, that idea bled out of Marathon and soaked into history, quietly, like a bruise that would later blossom into revolution. And the irony? It was, for all its stakes, kind of boring. 2 lines of infantry, no ambush, no magic trick, no thrilling last-minute save, just discipline, grit. A single decision run into hell now, or wait and die later. They chose to run. That's why it changed the world. Chapter 2. The Siege of Syracuse. Archimedes drew circles. Rome drew blood. It began with a groan-not, the shout of war or the clash of arms, but the slow, pitiful groan of ships dragged across dry Sicilian sand. Roman ships, warships, some of them not even finished. They were being hauled by oxen. Not exactly an awe-inspiring invasion, and if that wasn't humiliating enough, the men were exhausted before the siege had even begun. The sun above Syracuse blazed down on armour that was never meant for island summers. Helmets cooked brains, leather stuck to thighs, no glory in sight. The Romans had come to end resistance, not because Syracuse was dangerous, it wasn't, not really. The city was a half-loyal Greek holdout during the Second Punic War, still pretty in that coastal, sun-bleached way, but aging badly, caught between past glories and bad decisions. The Roman Senate, paranoid that Syracuse might swing toward Hannibal, sent a force to take it. They expected a quick siege, a light bruising, a simple campaign. What they got was a genius with a stick. Archimedes. Yes, that Archimedes. The one you know from bathtubs and exclamations of Eureka, the one who did math naked and got excited about displacement. Unfortunately for the Romans, he wasn't just good at science, he was a master of war science too, a weaponized nerd. And when the siege began, Archimedes didn't run or hide. He got to work. He designed catapults that could fire stones twice as far as any Roman machine. He built cranes that reached over the city walls, plucked Roman ships from the sea like a toddler grabbing bath toys, and smashed them back down. There were stories wild once of mirrors used to set ships on fire, of machines that pulled men from ladders by their ankles and flung them screaming into the sea. The Romans began to see monsters on the walls. Some refused to advance when the sun hit polished bronze just right. One legionnaire swore he saw a giant claw lift a trireme out of the water and snap it in half like a walnut. No one laughed, because for 2 full years nothing worked. Imagine that. Rome, the war machine, stuck in a stalemate because one old man with chalk had fortified a city with cleverness. They threw siege towers at the walls. They dug tunnels. They bribed traitors. They tried fire, starvation, even psychological warfare. And Syracuse, powered by geometry and stubbornness, refused to fall. Inside the city, people began to believe Archimedes was more than a man. They left offerings at his workshop. Soldiers whispered that the gods had granted him knowledge. The city's leaders, meanwhile, wavered between gratitude and fear, because while Archimedes was building machines of death, he also refused to compromise. He hated politics, loathed Roman pomp, laughed openly at generals. When emissaries tried to convince him to negotiate, he brushed them off. He was too busy solving for X. But siege warfare isn't fast. It's mud and boredom, rotting food, dysentery, rain that seeps into everything. The Romans got angry, impatient. And when their new general, Marcus Claudius Marcellus, arrived, he brought with him the thing Archimedes couldn't calculate, treachery. Someone inside the city opened a gate, just one. Just wide enough. Roman soldiers poured in before dawn, silently. They took the city before breakfast. Syracuse fell not to force, but to fatigue and betrayal. And here's where the story gets stupid. Marcellus, the new Roman commander, had issued a direct order. Do not harm Archimedes. He wanted him alive, wanted to parade the famous mathematician through Rome, a living trophy, proof that Roman glory could swallow Greek brilliance. But soldiers, especially sleep-deprived ones, aren't good with nuance. When they found Archimedes, he was kneeling in the sand, drawing geometric figures, circles, lines, strange symbols, a mind halfway between Earth and Olympus. He barely noticed the soldiers. When one demanded he stand, Archimedes, ever the genius, waved a hand and said, "Don't disturb my circles." So they killed him. That's it. No epic death, no final theorem. Just a spear, a twitch, and the end of one of the greatest minds in human history, because a soldier didn't like being told to wait. After the city fell, Marcellus wept, or so the story goes. He ordered a tomb built, marking the spot with a carving of a sphere inside a cylinderone of Archimedes' favourite proofs. Years later, Cicero, the Roman orator, claimed he found it overgrown with weeds, forgotten, like the man himself. What makes this siege matter isn't the blood. It wasn't even particularly bloody. It wasn't decisive in the Punic War. It didn't save Hannibal. It didn't crush Rome. But it marked the end of something that couldn't be measured with swords or walls. It was the last time the Greeks stood on their own terms. Syracuse was the last gasp of Hellenistic independence. After this, Rome didn't just take city-sit, absorbed them, reshaped them, painted its face over theirs. Greek knowledge would be copied, taught, claimed. But never again would it stand apart, fiercely its own. Archimedes was the symbol of that pure intellect, undiluted by empire, answering to no one but truth itself. And what did Rome give us in return? Roads, laws, baths, concrete, 1,000 things we still use, sure, but something else too, a kind of quiet violence, the violence of forgetting. They built over greatness, made it theirs. They were efficient that way. Ask most people today who won the siege of Syracuse and they'll shrug. Ask them who Archimedes was and they'll say the bath guy, maybe smile. But for 2 years his mind held back a machine that would swallow the world, not with swords, with sign. The siege of Syracuse wasn't glorious. It was awkward, prolonged, frustrating. It ended with a bribe and a mistake. But within its dull, grinding pages lived the last brilliant breath of Greek defiancia, war waged with pulleys and chalk, in sand and silence, until all the light in it was extinguished by a man who didn't know what he was looking at. Chapter 3. The Battle of the Teutoburg Forest. 3 legions disappear. It started with fog, not the poetic kind, the wet, clinging kind that sinks into your bones and makes everything smell like rot. It curled through the trees of the Teutoburg forest like a lurking animal, wrapping around spears, soaking cloaks, muting footsteps. The Romans marched through it anyway, not because they liked it, but because they didn't know better. They were Romans. They had roads, formations, arrogance, and none of it would save them. They weren't in Gaul anymore. This was Germanian tamed, unpaved, uninterested in Roman law or hygiene. No wine amphorae here, no marble columns. Just damp woods, thick with oak and pine, the air heavy with mushroom spores, and the kind of silence that meant something was watching. It should have been a red flag. It wasn't. The Roman general in charge, Publius Quinctilius Varus, had been assured that everything was fine, peaceful, under control. He believed it because the man telling him so was named Arminius, a Roman-trained officer of the local Germanic tribes. He spoke fluent Latin. He had the face of a statue and the manners of a senator. He'd served in the Roman army. He'd drunk their wine, worn their armour. He was exactly what Rome liked, a barbarian made civilized. The kind they could point to and say, "See, we're improving the world." Arminius smiled and nodded and promised loyalty, all while planning the end of everything Varus understood. Because Arminius wasn't Roman, not in his bones. He was Cheruscione of the many tribal groups east of the Rhine. He saw what Rome really was, an invader, a devourer, a system that flattened gods and customs into provinces and taxes. He didn't want to be part of it, so he plotted. The trap was beautiful in its simplicity. Arminius fed Varus just enough anxiety to make him act. Whispers of rebellion, trouble in the east, minor unrest, enough to make Varus march but not panic. Arminius even offered to guide the way, through the forest, through the mud, through the jaws of death. Varus brought 3 legions with him, 3 full Roman legions, somewhere between 15, 0 to 20, 0 men. Marching in a long stretched-out column through terrain they didn't understand, in weather they didn't like, led by a man they thought was theirs. They brought civilians, 2 families, wives, servants. They moved slowly, no scouts, no proper flanks. The legions were built for open ground, not the twisted gnarls of forest paths. Each tree was a blind corner, each bend in the road a trap. And then the rain started. Not a drizzly torrent, unrelenting. It turned roads to rivers, wagons bogged down. Armour rusted as they wore it, horses spooked, campfires fizzled, orders were barked and lost in the wind. Morale didn't just dip, it dissolved. And just when things couldn't get worse, the trees came alive. Spears from nowhere, rocks from above, screams in a language the Romans didn't understand. Germanic warriors poured from the woods, painted, roaring, slashing through the column like a hot knife through wet bread. The Romans tried to form ranks, but there was no room. They were scattered, vulnerable, disoriented. Every advantage Rome was supposed to have, discipline, formation, heavy armour, became a burden. For 3 days, it rained blood and panic. This wasn't a battle, it was a slow-motion massacre, and no one could stop it. Varus, realizing the scale of the disaster, didn't rally his troops. He didn't call for retreat. He fell on his sword, the Roman way of saying, "I really messed up, and I'd rather not face the emperor about it." Some officers tried to regroup. A few detachments broke off and fought their way through the brush, only to be cut down later. By the end, not a single Roman soldier escaped with their legion intact. The numbers are rough, but the result was clear. 3 entire Roman legions were wiped off the face of the earth, not defeated, erased. Their eagles, the sacred standards carried into battle, were taken. Their bones were left unburied, their names forgotten in official records, and somewhere, in the drizzle, Arminius disappeared into the woods, victorious and silent. Back in Rome, the news landed like a brick through a stained glass window. Emperor Augustus, calm, stoic, the image of imperial control, reportedly smashed his head against a wall and shouted, "Quinctilius Varus, give me back my legions," not because he cared about Varus, but because he realized what had just happened. The empire had a limit. Rome had thought of itself as endless, unstoppable. It had swallowed Gaul. It had crushed Carthage. It had strutted through Egypt in sandals made of smugness. But in the Teutoburg forest, it met something it couldn't digest, a world that refused to be Romanized. And Rome learned. Oh, it learned. The empire stopped trying to conquer beyond the Rhine, for good. Instead, it built walls. It reinforced the frontier. It put up watchtowers and outposts and told itself it was a choice, not a retreat. But it was a retreat. The dream of Germania as just another Roman province died in the mud beside Varus. And Arminius? He became a symbol, not just for Germans, but for anyone who'd ever looked at an empire and said, no. He didn't live a long or peaceful life. He was eventually assassinated by his own people, as is tradition, but his name endured. A thorn in Rome's side, a reminder that sometimes all it takes to stop a machine is a quiet lie and the right forest. Most people don't learn this battle in school. It's not cinematic. No heroes, no dramatic last stands, just fog, mud, spears. And a catastrophe so complete it made the mightiest empire on earth rethink its entire strategy. And maybe that's why it matters so much. Because it wasn't grand, it was embarrassing. The real impact of Teutoburg isn't just military, it's psychological. After this, Rome ruled with more caution. Expansion slowed. Fortifications became the priority. And centuries later, when German nationalism needed a hero, they dusted off Arminius, renamed him Hermann, and built statues in his honour, because nothing stings like the one that got away. So no, it wasn't an epic clash of titans. There were no glorious charges, no thunderous cavalry. Just 3 legions marching into a forest they didn't understand, trusting a man they thought was theirs, and vanishing without a trace. A simple, stupid, perfect ambush. The empire blinked, and for once, the world didn't blink back. Chapter 4. The Battle of Tours, 1 franc, 1 crescent moon, and a lot of goats. It did not begin with a grand declaration or a dramatic drumbeat. It began, as many things do in 8th century France, with sheep. The fields near the town of Tours were dotted with them, munching contentedly under the full sun. Their only concern was grass. The men approaching, however, had bigger appetites. From the south came the forces of the Umayyad Caliphate, recently victorious across the Pyrenees. They had swept up through Spain, like wind through a curtain fast, efficient and unstoppable. Their general, Abd al-Rahman al-Ghafiqi, was confident. He had cavalry, archers, supplies, and momentum. His forces moved like a tide, toppling weak Christian kingdoms, gathering loot, and spreading the dominion of Islam one skirmish at a time. Now, they had pushed deep into Frankish territory. They'd even raided the church of St. Martin at Tours, a rich symbol of Christian piety, a particularly shiny target. From the north came the Franks, led by a man whose name was as blunt as his sword, Charles Martel, Charles the Hammer. He wasn't a king, though he would eventually start a dynasty that would give rise to Charlemagne. At the time, he was more like the COO of a chaotic emperor, mayor of the palace, who managed the daily business of the Frankish realms while its puppet kings drank and prayed and tried not to die of dysentery. Charles had fought battles before. He had no love for pageantry, no flashy banners, no emotional speeches. He didn't march his army south with the intent of glory. He marched because if he didn't, France and maybe all of Europe would change forever. They met in October 732 CE. We call it the Battle of Tours. Some call it the Battle of Poitiers. The people who fought it probably didn't call it anything. It wasn't particularly fast or cinematic. It didn't end in a single triumphant charge. It was cold, it was tense, and for the most part, it was just people standing in a field, not dying. Charles took up position on a wooded hill, a smart move. High ground meant control, and the forest around his position, limited cavalry, movement bad news for the Umayyads, who relied heavily on fast, powerful mounted units. The Frankish soldiers stood in tight, defensive phalanxes, shoulder to shoulder, shields locked, not flashy, but solid. They were not professional soldiers, but they were tough farmers, villagers, minor nobles used to holding lines, following orders, and enduring bad weather. The Umayyads expected an easy fight. They had outmaneuvered larger armies before, and they didn't fear the Franks, who seemed slow, poorly dressed, and stubbornly silent. For days, the two forces watched each other. Skirmishes flared, scouts vanished, tension thickened. It was like waiting for a thunderstorm to break, only no one knew when or how hard it would fall. Finally, the Umayyads attacked. Their cavalry charged the Frankish lines again and again, looking for weaknesses. There were none. The Franks held, spears braced, shields splintered. Charles moved his men not with flourish, but with calculated precision. Wherever the lines wavered, he reinforced them. Wherever the cavalry circled, he closed ranks. Hours passed. The field churned into mud and blood, and still the Franks didn't break. But the real turning point didn't come from the front, it came from the back. While the main fighting raged, a rumour spread through the Umayyad ranks. Their camp behind enemy lines was under attack, possibly by Frankish raiders, possibly not. But in that instant, the illusion of control broke. Some of the Muslim troops broke formation to protect the camp, others wavered. Confusion rippled through the lines. Abd al-Rahman tried to restore order but was killed in the melee. With their leader dead and chaos spreading, the Umayyad forces began to pull back. The next morning, Charles didn't find an enemy ready to fight. He found empty tents. The Umayyads had retreated overnight, vanishing into the woods, heading back toward Iberia. No dramatic final clash. No surrender. Just a quiet, fog-drenched field littered with broken spears and a lot of confused sheep. Historians have argued ever since whether this battle was as important as the legends claim. Voltaire dismissed it. Some medieval chroniclers called it a divine miracle. Others treated it like a footnote. What's clear is that the Muslim advance into Western Europe stopped here. They didn't try again. For the Franks, and later for Christendom, Tours became a symbolic wall, the place where the Islamic tide crested and receded. Was Charles Martel a genius? Maybe, maybe not. His tactics weren't revolutionary, his men weren't invincible, but he played to his strengths: terrain, patience, and a tight fist. He didn't chase glory, strangled uncertainty. The odd thing is that the battle wasn't even that big, not by ancient standards. We don't know the exact number of soldiers, and most of the contemporary sources contradict each other. But we do know that what happened here echoed far beyond the battlefield. This wasn't just about who controlled a hillside in France. It was about who would shape the cultural spine of Europe. Had the Umayyads won, it's possible that Islamic rule would have reached into Central Europe. The Renaissance might have worn a different face. Gothic cathedrals might have given way to minarets. Charles Martel didn't just hold a line, he held a path, a future. But none of that was obvious at the time, not to the soldiers nursing bruises, or the peasants picking over discarded weapons, or the monks trying to repair the church at Tours. It felt like just another ugly clash on the edge of empire. And that's the thing about these so-called boring battles. No one names them correctly while they're happening. No one gives them hashtags. They unfold slowly, muddy, grey. They're not heroic charges or golden age finales. They're moments where the world almost shifted and didn't. If you stood on that hill the day after the battle, you'd smell damp wool, blood, and the cold breath of oncoming winter. You wouldn't hear trumpets. You'd hear the bleating of sheep and the sigh of tired men cleaning their weapons. And yet, in that silent post-battle dawn, the shape of Europe settled into place. Chapter 5. The Battle of Jalut. The Mongols get stopped. Finally. There was dust in everything under fingernails, in waterskins, behind eyelids, dust that stuck to your teeth and made the air taste like bone. The valley of Jezreel, in the heart of 13th century Palestine, wasn't the most welcoming place to begin with, and now it was the backdrop for something no one had believed possible. A Mongol army stalled. Not just stalled waiting. The Mongols didn't wait. That was their whole thing. They moved, fast, relentless. They had stormed out of the Asian steppe like the wrath of a furious god, leaving smashed cities and smoking skull pyramids behind. They were a force of nature, unstoppable, until now. It was the year 1260, and they had just sacked Baghdad, the intellectual heart of the Muslim world. The Abbasid Caliph was rolled up in a carpet and trampled by horses. Yes, really. That's how complete the Mongol victory was. They didn't even bother with conventional execution, and after Baghdad, the empire fractured. Cities surrendered before the Mongols arrived just to avoid being turned into gravel. They marched into Syria, took Aleppo, then Damascus, each like stepping over twigs. Everyone knew Egypt was next. Nothing could stop them. Except maybe Cairo didn't get the memo. Enter the Mamluks. Former slave soldiers, trained from childhood, forged into a professional military caste that now ruled Egypt. These were not paper generals or peacock princes. These were killers raised in war, and they were led by Sultan Qutuz, a man who had clawed his way into power by assassination and sheer will. With him rode Baibars, a brilliant, hot-headed commander whose name you'll want to remember. When the Mongols sent a message demanding surrender, Qutuz didn't send envoys or delay with diplomatic doublespeak. He beheaded the Mongol envoys and nailed their heads to Cairo's gates. That's not a metaphor. The Mongols were shocked, then enraged, then intrigued. Someone was finally dumb or bold enough to say no. But they weren't at full strength. Hulagu Khan, the Mongol commander in the region, had withdrawn the bulk of his army east after hearing that the Great Khan had died in Mongolia. Succession crisis. These things happened. He left behind a smaller force under Kitbuka, a capable but slightly less terrifying general. And so, when the Mamluks marched north from Egypt, it was to face a Mongol army that was, for once, vulnerable. Still, no one expected the Mamluks to win. They met at a place called End Jalut, Spring of Goliath, named after the spot where David was said to have slain the Philistine giant. Whether anyone realized the poetry of that is unknown. But if they did, they were probably too focused on not dying to enjoy the symbolism. The Mamluks chose their ground carefully. They hid part of their cavalry in the surrounding hills. The rest formed a visible, tempting line. The Mongols approached, confident. They always were. They charged. And then something amazing happened. The Mamluks retreated, on purpose. A fake retreater, classic Mongol tactic, now turned against them. It worked. Kitbuka ordered his men to pursue. They chased the Mamluks into the valley. And as they closed in, Baibar's hidden cavalry burst from the hillsides and hit the Mongol flanks like a hammer. The trap snapped shut. For the first time in living memory, a Mongol army was not just defeated, it was routed. Kitbuka fought to the end, refusing to surrender. His body was left on the field. The invincible had bled. News spread like fire, doused in oil. The Mongols could be stopped. Their aura cracked, the myth of inevitability gone. The Mamluks returned to Cairo, not just as victors, but as defenders of Islam, of civilization, of the idea that no army, no matter how brutal or fast, was truly immortal. The thing about End Jalut is, by tactical standards, it wasn't exceptional. It was a well-planned ambush. The kind of thing taught in war colleges today, with tidy maps and helpful arrows. It didn't last long. It wasn't massive. No cities burned, but the psychological damage was seismic. Every power that had faced the Mongols had either been crushed or submitted. Russia, China, the Islamic Caliphate, even the Crusader states trembled like paper held to flame. End Jalut changed that. It showed the world, loudly, bloodily, that the Mongols were not gods. This wasn't just a military win, it was a civilizational breath. After decades of terror, someone had punched back. And for the Islamic world, still reeling from the fall of Baghdad, it was a rallying cry. Qutuz didn't enjoy his victory for long. Shortly after the battle, he was assassinated. Baibars, whose name you were supposed to remember, took power. He ruled for years, beat back crusaders, rebuilt cities, and became a legend in his own right. He understood, better than most, that this victory wasn't just about land or pride. It was about fear, and the Mamluks had just shattered it. Today, most people don't know Ein Jalut. It's buried beneath centuries of louder wars. It's not taught alongside Waterloo or Gettysburg. No Hollywood films. No sweeping scores or slow-motion cavalry charges. But it should be, because this was the moment the Mongol juggernaut tripped, and the world exhaled. A battle where one army didn't quite finish the job, and the other didn't live long enough to celebrate, but in that mess, in that dust, history turned its head slightly and blinked. And maybe that's enough. Chapter 6. The Battle of Castillon, Cannons, Mud, and the End of Chivalry. It rained the day before Castillon, the kind of rain that makes everything feel heavier, as if the sky has given up pretending. The ground turned to clay, thick and uncooperative. Horses hated it. So did men. The river Dordogne, nearby, swelled just enough to become a problem. Not enough to drown anyone, just enough to delay everything and make tempers flare. And yet, they marched. It was July 1453, and England was trying, desperately, to hold on to something it should have lost years earlier, Aquitaine. The 100 Years' War, which had long since stopped being about anything besides inertia, was groaning toward its conclusion. There was no more honour in it, just taxes, hunger, and dirt. England still claimed lands in France. France wanted them back. Neither side believed peace was real until the other was incapable of making war. And so the English army, led by John Talbot, honest Earl of Shrewsbury, advanced toward Castillon. Talbot was the kind of man they write songs Abu told school, loyal, brave, and increasingly obsolete. He'd been fighting for decades. He had scars, he had stories. He believed in valour, in knightly charges, in banners and nobles, and the righteousness of tradition. He still wore full plate armour, even though gunpowder was busy making that kind of thing embarrassing. The French, on the other hand, were evolving. They had learned finally that chivalry was nice, but cannons were better, big ones, new ones. Managed by Jean Bureau, a Parisian banker turned artillery engineer, who approached war like an accountant with explosives. Under his direction, the French had built an artillery park near Castillon, fortified it with earthworks, and waited. Talbot thought it was a siege, that the French were trying to starve out the small garrison at Castillon. His scouts reported a retreat. The French camp was apparently being abandoned. Perfect. Talbot, ever the knight, ordered an attack. This was the last time an English noble would charge headlong into a fortified gun position with full confidence in God and muscle. The initial charge went well, at least. It looked like it did. The English cavalry routed some camp followers. The tents appeared abandoned, but they weren't. They were decoys. The French hadn't retreated. They had dug in. Artillery behind earthworks, gunmen in trenches, a wall of firepower waiting in silence. Talbot, mounted and exposed, led the assault directly into it. The cannons opened fire. It wasn't elegant, no knightly duels, no chance to swing a sword or shout defiance, just thunder, smoke, men torn apart in seconds, horses collapsing mid-gallop. The English lines faltered, then broke. Talbot, refusing to retreat, tried to rally the troops. He rode back and forth like a man in a painting, bellowing orders no one could hear over the roar of bombardment. Then his horse was killed, then his sons. They fought on foot. and then, surrounded, they fell. Talbot died not in a final duel, but in the mud, under artillery fire, likely crushed. The details are vague. Some say he was shot, some say he was trampled. But everyone agrees. The man who embodied chivalry was pulverized by modernity. When it was over, the English army was gone. Not scattered, not regrouped, gone. Between cannon fire and French reinforcements, yes, the French returned during the chaos the English were slaughtered. Some surrendered. Most didn't get the chance. It wasn't a huge battle in terms of numbers, but it was enormous in terms of symbolism. Castillon marked the end of the 100 Years' War. England would lose all its French holdings except Calais, and even that would vanish a century later. The dream of a continental English empire dead in the French dirt. More importantly, the knight was dead. Or at least, the idea of him. Gunpowder had been around for a while, but Castillon was one of the first times it wasn't just an accessory, it was the main act. Bureau's artillery didn't just support the French army, it was the French army. Talbot's knights never had a chance. It wasn't about courage anymore, it was about calculation, fortifications, trajectories, timing. The battlefield had changed, and Castillon made that clear in the ugliest way possible. What's strange is how few people remember it. Ask most about the end of the 100 Years' War, and they'll mention Joan of Arc, who, by the way, had been dead for over 20 years by the time this happened. They'll think of sieges or dramatic coronations. But the last blow, the one that knocked England off the continent and introduced the age of cannon and trench, happened in a swampy meadow with bad weather and worse assumptions. There were no grand speeches, no final monologues, just the sound of splintering wood and the silence that comes after gunfire. Talbot was buried by the French. They treated him with honour. Even his enemies knew what he represented, a fading idea, noble but naive. He had fought the old way in a world that no longer accepted it. His death wasn't just a loss for England. It was the final punctuation mark on a whole chapter of history. After Castillon, war got louder, smokier, less personal. Banners gave way to battalions. Knights gave way to gunmen. And history, in its relentless march, left behind the age of chivalry, not with a bang but with a measured, well-aimed cannonball to the face. Chapter 7. The Battle of Plassey. Rain, Rice, and a Bribe. The day of the Battle of Plassey began with sweat and ended with a bribe. That's about all anyone agrees on. There were guns, yes, cannons, technically, infantry. But this was not a battle in the heroic sense more, like a confused exchange of favours under tropical rain. It was June 23rd, 1757. The sky above Bengal was a humid sheet of steel grey, sagging with the promise of a monsoon. Fields lay flat and steaming. Palm trees didn't so much sway as sag in surrender, and in this sodden corner of northeastern India, a literal company, with shareholders and accountants prepared to fight a king. That company was the British East India Company, a corporation with a flag, an army, and all the charm of a colonial landlord trying to pretend it's not just here for the profits. Led by Robert Clive, a self-promoting former clerk turned military commander, the company had spent years building forts, issuing threats, and inserting itself into local politics like an unwanted guest who now insists on running the house. Across the field stood Siraj-ud-Dowlah, the Nawab of Bengal. He was young, wealthy, suspicious of the British, and not entirely wrong to be. The company had fortified Calcutta without his permission, smuggled goods to avoid taxes, and generally behaved like a foreign power pretending to be polite. Siraj had retaliated, captured Calcutta, and allegedly caused the infamous Black Hole incident, where dozens of British prisoners died in a cramped cell. Whether it happened the way the British claimed is still debated, but the outrage it stirred was real. Clive wanted revenge, but more than that, he wanted control. And here's the part that makes Plassey truly ridiculous. Clive wasn't counting on force. He was counting on treachery. In the days before the battle, Clive had been corresponding secretly with Mir Jafar, one of Siraj's senior commanders and relatives. Mir Jafar had ambition, a grudge, and no particular loyalty to Siraj. Clive offered him a deal: sit out the battle, or better yet, defect, and you'll be the next Nawab. Oh, and the company will make you rich. Richer, at least. Mir Jafar said yes. So when the battle began, it was already over. The two armies assembled near the village of Palashi, which the British spelled Plassey in the usual tradition of mangling local names. Siraj's force was vast estimates say over 50, 0 men, including cavalry, war elephants, and artillery supplied by the French. Clive had around 3, 0, a few hundred British regulars and the rest Indian sepoys. The odds were cartoonishly uneven. But Siraj's men didn't know the deal had been made. The battle started late in the morning. The Nawab's cannons opened fire, booming across the flat fields. The British responded. Everyone got wet. Then the sky split and the rain came. Sheets of it. It turned the battlefield into a swamp. Clive's men quickly covered their gunpowder and ammunition with tarpaulins. Siraj's artillery, less prepared, got soaked. Their cannons sputtered out like wet matches. Siraj, inexperienced and already paranoid, made the worst possible decision. He ordered a retreat. Not a full one, but enough to confuse his men. And while some of them pulled back, others stood still, watching Clive's troops now advance cautiously through the drizzle. That was when Mir Jafar's forces, stationed off to the side, did nothing. They didn't charge. They didn't protect Siraj's flanks. They just stood there. To Siraj, the betrayal was suddenly obvious. His lines crumbled. Confusion turned into panic. Soldiers ran. Clive's men pressed forward, encountering more retreat than resistance. The Nawab fled the field. A few hours later, the British were in control. Not because of courage. Not because of tactics. Because of contracts. Siraj was captured days later and killed by agents loyal to Mir Jafar. Clive installed Mir Jafar as a puppet Nawab and claimed victory not just in the battle but in Bengal. The company was now more than a trader. It was a ruler. What happened next was a slow-motion disaster. Clive sent gold and goods back to Britain. Shareholders got rich. Mir Jafar tried to balance loyalty with dignity and failed at both. The company tightened its grip, demanded payments, manipulated succession. Bengal, once among the richest regions in the world, began a decline. Famines would follow. So would revolts. But that day at Plassey, the foundations were laid. This was the moment a corporation conquered a country. Not with a mighty charge, not with a technological edge, with bribery, monsoon strategy, and paperwork. Clive was hailed as a hero back in Britain. He was given titles, estates, a seat in Parliament. He told Parliament he had resisted the temptation to enrich himself during the conquest. They believed him. Sort of. Then his finances started getting complicated. It turns out running a colony like a business comes with messy spreadsheets. Eventually, even the British government got nervous. The East India Company had become too powerful, too rich, too arrogant. Decades later, the Crown would step in and take over direct rule after a rebellion. But by then, the damage and the precedent was done. Ask someone today what the Battle of Plassey was, and most won't know. Even in India, it's overshadowed by later, bloodier uprisings. But this quiet, muddy betrayal under monsoon skies reshaped global history. It marked the beginning of British imperialism in India, the start of 2 centuries of exploitation dressed in velvet language. And it all started not with a decisive clash, but with a paid betrayal and a very soggy cannon crew. Chapter 8. The Battle of Königgrätz. Prussia gets serious. The thing about Königgrätz is that no one involved seemed entirely sure whether they were about to make history or just have a very bad day. It was the summer of 1866, and Europe was doing that thing it loved in the 19th century, adjusting borders like furniture, squinting suspiciously at neighbours, and preparing for a war no one wanted, but everyone had been quietly planning. In this case, the war was between Austria and Prussiato-German-speaking powers, sharing a long, awkward history and zero trust. The pretext was control over the German Confederation. The reality was simpler. Both wanted to be the boss of Central Europe, and there wasn't enough crown polish for 2 emperors. Prussia was led by Otto von Bismarck, a man with the face of a thundercloud and the soul of a chessboard. Bismarck wasn't interested in speeches or pageantry. He believed in power, force, realpolitik, and he had a plan. If Prussia could defeat Austria decisively, it could seize leadership of the German states and form something new, something big, something ominous. Austria, meanwhile, was led by tradition, bureaucracy, and a deep sense of entitlement. Its generals wore more medals than brains. Its army was a multilingual Frankenstein of Hungarians, Slavs, Germans, Czechs, and Italian shelled, together mostly by marching songs and uncomfortable uniforms. They weren't bad soldiers. They were just managed badly. The battle came to a head near the small Bohemian town of Sadowa, not far from Königgrätz, on July 3, 1866. The Austrians took up a strong defensive position. They had more men, better rifles, high ground, and yet, as the mist lifted from the fields that morning, it became very clear very quickly that none of that was going to save them. Prussia had brought something new, the needle gun. It was a breech, loading rifle that could fire more quickly than anything the Austrians carried. That meant the Prussian infantry could shoot while lying down, reload faster, and basically shred any traditional line formation foolish enough to walk toward them. Which, unfortunately, is exactly what the Austrians did. But weapons alone don't win battles. Trains do. Prussia had used its rail network modern, efficient, obsessively planned to move and coordinate troops at a speed Austria couldn't match. This was not the clumsy march of the Napoleonic era. It was logistical choreography, precision, timetables. The kind of war that looks boring until you realise the people running it could have also managed a national postal system blindfolded. At first, it was chaos. The Prussians, under General Helmuth von Moltke, attacked the Austrian right flank. The Austrians held briefly, then the centre came under fire. Then the Prussian Second Army delayed by a day, but now arriving just in time struck from the north. The Austrians had thought the Second Army was still far away. They were wrong. It had travelled by rail, in secret, and now it slammed into the Austrian flank like a quiet, well-dressed wrecking ball. The battle tipped suddenly. What had looked like a stalemate turned into a collapse. Austrian artillery couldn't keep up. Cavalry charges floundered in the mud. Units became confused, disoriented. The Prussians didn't pursue with fury, they advanced with mathematics. They moved like a metronome, measured, brutal, exact. There were no romantic last stands. Just rifle fire and regiments crumbling under it. The Austrians retreated across the river Elbe, barely avoiding total destruction. In all, they lost over 40, 0 men killed, wounded, or captured. The Prussians lost fewer than 10, 0. It wasn't just a defeat, it was a humiliation. Austria, the old empire with its operas and emperors and archdukes, had been punched in the face by a cold, efficient, increasingly ambitious cousin. After Königgrätz, the writing was on the wall. Bismarck moved quickly. He made peace without trying to utterly destroy Austria, wasn't interested in revenge. He wanted leverage. Austria would step back from German affairs. Prussia would take the lead. The German Confederation would be dissolved, and the stage was now set for something much larger, the unification of Germany. Königgrätz isn't remembered with the same emotional weight as Waterloo or Gettysburg. There's no heroic stand, no tragic sacrifice. It's remembered when it's remembered at all for what it enabled, the rise of modern Germany. A militarized, industrialized powerhouse built not on banners and horses, but on rail schedules and rifles that didn't care about your accent. This was the war where old Europe died without realizing it. Austrian generals still wore sabres and monocles. Prussian officers carried telegraphs and maps. One side was planning the future. The other was hoping tradition would somehow bail them out. It didn't. What makes Königgrätz so quietly world-shifting is not just the size of the loss. It's the lesson it wrote in cannon smoke across the plains of Bohemia. The future belongs to those who can move faster, think colder, and fire more often. It wasn't dramatic. It wasn't even loud. It was just the sound of something ending a slow grind of cavalry against repeating rifles, of medals clinking while uniforms soaked in sweat. And somewhere in the distance, Bismarck smiled. Because this wasn't the final act. It was the overture. Chapter 9. The Battle of Adwa. A humiliated empire, an African triumph. It was still dark when they moved. No trumpets, no speeches, just soft murmurs, the creak of leather, and the distant clinking of spears in the chilly highland air. The Ethiopian stands of thousands of them were on the march. They didn't look like a modern army. Many wore white cotton tunics. Some carried swords that had passed down through generations. Some had muskets, others rifles. Most had walked for days. They weren't uniformed. They weren't standardized. But they were organized. They knew the land. They had a plan. On the other side of the rocky hills near the town of Adwa, the Italians waited, cold and uncertain. It was March 1, 1896, and Italy was about to learn a hard truth, the kind usually delivered in a language the powerful rarely bother to learn. Africa wasn't just going to lie down. Italy's plan had been simple: join the Imperial Club. Britain, France, Belgium, everyone else had carved their names into the continent. Italy was late to the game and hungry to prove itself. So they looked east toward the Horn of Africa and tried to assert control over Ethiopia, a Christian kingdom they assumed would collapse under the pressure of modern European arms. What they hadn't counted on was Menelik II, Emperor of Ethiopia. And Menelik wasn't interested in being anyone's subject. Menelik had played a careful game. He'd signed treaties, yes, but when Italy tried to use a deliberately mistranslated version of one treaty to claim Ethiopia as a protectorate, he called their bluff. Quietly, methodically, he began to arm. He imported rifles, artillery, ammunition. He raised taxes. He called the nobility. He summoned the warriors. North, south, east, westmen from every region of Ethiopia began to converge. Amharas, Oromos, Tigrayans, Christians, Muslims. Tribes that didn't always trust each other, but all answered the same call. By the time Menelik was done, he had gathered what may have been the largest army in Africa, at the time estimates say, over 100 zero troops, including tens of thousands of riflemen. And they were not coming to negotiate. The Italians had fewer than 18 zero. Led by General Oreste Baratieri, they had camped in the mountains near Adwa, unsure whether to dig in or retreat. Baratieri, despite commanding a modern army, wasn't keen on fighting. He knew he was outnumbered. He wanted to wait. His officers wanted glory. Rome wanted results. Newspapers wanted headlines. Someone in the government allegedly told him to act before Ethiopia's army melted away. So he did. He marched at night toward what he thought was a lightly held enemy position. It wasn't. The Italians split into columns, trying to scale hills in the dark, but the terrain betrayed them. The local guides got confused. The units lost contact. And just as the sun rose and the fog began to lift, the Italians realized what they'd walked into. An Ethiopian army that hadn't melted away had taken up positions and was now encircling them. The battle itself was chaos. Ethiopian units surged down the hills in waves. Menelik's wife, Empress Teutu, commanded her own troops and brought artillery. Riflemen rained fire from ridges. Sword-wielding warriors charged with terrifying speed. Italian officers tried to rally, to form lines, but they couldn't see each other, couldn't coordinate. The terrain split them. Men were cut off, flanked, overrun. One Italian brigade was surrounded and annihilated. Another was forced to surrender after running out of ammunition. Those who fled were hunted down by cavalry. The fighting lasted for hours, but the outcome was never in doubt. By the end of the day, over 6-0 Italians were dead, thousands more wounded or captured, whole battalions wiped from the map. The Ethiopians had taken losses too, but they stood victorious. Menelik had not only won a battle, he had humiliated a European empire on the battlefield, the first African power to do so in the modern era. The world was stunned. Europe didn't know what to say. This wasn't supposed to happen. Africa was meant to be divided, pacified, governed. The image of black soldiers overwhelming white troops broke every smug imperial assumption. And it wasn't just a one-off. Menelik had orchestrated it, planned it, delivered it. He treated prisoners humanely, sent diplomats to negotiate peace, and then went back to ruling a kingdom that had just made clear it didn't need saving. Thank you very much. Italy, meanwhile, fell into political crisis. The Prime Minister resigned. Riots broke out. Parliament panicked. The army's reputation crumbled. They had not just lost a battle. They had lost face, and there is no currency in empire more fragile than dignity. Ask someone today about Adwa, and unless they're Ethiopian or a historian, it's likely they've never heard of it. There are no Oscar-winning films, no famous poems. But for Ethiopia, the memory burns bright. Statues, a national holiday, streets named after the generals. And not because it was just a win, but because it proved Africa could fight back and win. Menelik didn't invade Rome. He didn't need to. The message had been sent, loudly. Ethiopia would remain independent, one of only 2 African nations to do so during the height of European imperialism. Adwa wasn't a perfect battle. Communication was difficult. Casualties were high. But it didn't need to be perfect. It just needed to disprove a lie that European dominance was inevitable. And it did. In a war that started with a bad translation, a dismissive empire, and an underestimated king, it ended with blood in the hills and the roaring, unambiguous fact that Ethiopia was not for sale. Chapter 10. The Battle of Midway, 6 minutes that reversed the Pacific War. It started with a code. Not a shot, not a siren, a code. A cryptic Japanese message intercepted by American intelligence in a small, sweaty office where nobody carried a weapon, and the most dangerous piece of equipment was probably a pencil. The message said something about an attack on a location referred to only as AF. No one knew what that meant. Some guessed it might be Midway, tiny atoll in the middle of the Pacific that looked like a smear on most maps and was mostly known for its ability to host a landing strip and collect bird poop. So they tested it. The Americans sent a fake message. Midway is low on water over an unsecured channel. Hours later, they intercepted a Japanese message. AF reports water shortage. Gotcha. That moment, that little trick of language and patience, set into motion one of the most decisive battles in naval history. And unless you're a military history nerd, or have watched a very specific kind of documentary, narrated by a man with a gravelly voice, you might not realize how the entire Pacific War pivoted in about 6 minutes. It was June 1942, 6 months after Pearl Harbor. Japan had taken island after island, stretching its reach across the Pacific like a hand gathering chips at a poker table. The Americans were still licking their wounds, morale was low, ships were down, men were dying, and Japan, confident, cunning, organized, decided it was time to finish the job. The idea was simple. Japan would lure the remaining US carriers into a trap near Midway, destroy them, and force America into a defensive crouch. Once the US carriers' navy was broken, the Pacific would belong to the Empire. But thanks to that broken code, America was already waiting. The Japanese fleet was enormous for aircraft carriers, battleships, cruisers, destroyers, submarines. It moved like a shadow across the sea, believing it was unseen. But U.S. Blant. Admiral Chester Nimitz had positioned 3 carriers Enterprise, Hornet, and Yorktown to ambush the ambushers. What followed wasn't elegant. It was messy, complicated. Long stretches of silence interrupted by chaos. At first, things went wrong. American planes launched too early, got lost, ran out of fuel. Bombers attacked without fighter cover and were shredded by Japanese Zeros. One squadron, Torpedo Squadron 8, flew straight into hell. All 15 planes were shot down. 1 pilot survived. 1. It looked like a disaster. And then it happened. At 10:22 a.m., with Japanese carriers vulnerable, their decks cluttered with refueling aircraft and bombs, 3 squadrons of American dive bombers appeared overhead. They had gotten lost. They had wandered. They had stumbled into the most critical moment of the battle by accident. What followed took just 6 minutes. 3 Japanese carriers, Akagi, Kaga, and Soria hit. Bombs tore through their decks, igniting fuel and ammunition. Explosions ripped their hulls apart. Planes burst into flame before they could take off. Men screamed, jumped into the sea, burned. Within hours, all 3 ships were lost. The 4th, Hiryu, counterattacked and managed to damage the Yorktown, but it too was later found and destroyed. All 4 Japanese carriers gone. It's hard to overstate what this meant. Before Midway, Japan had been advancing without pause. After Midway, it would never again launch an offensive campaign of that scale. The tide had turned, quietly, bloodily, and fast. The Japanese Navy lost not just ships, but hundreds of its most experienced pilots and deck crew. These weren't replaceable. Japan's training pipeline took years. America's took months. The math of the war had changed. Midway wasn't just a victory, it was the beginning of a long, slow inevitability. And here's the thing. Most of the sailors didn't know any of this. If you were on the deck of a destroyer that day, or in the engine room of a carrier, it just felt like noise and smoke and fire. There were no speeches, no banners, just work. Terrible, exhausting, terrifying work. And the battle itself? It wasn't a Hollywood set piece. It was scattered across hundreds of miles of ocean. Pilots never saw the enemy until seconds before the bombs dropped. Many didn't come back. Communications were delayed. Confusion reigned. Commanders made guesses, and some of those guesses, against all odds, were right. That's why it changed the world. Because sometimes history isn't a clean arse, it's a jagged, shuddering moment of luck, death, and someone pressing the right button at the exact wrong time. When the battle ended, and the seas calmed, there was no celebration. The Americans had won, yes, but they had also bled. Yorktown would eventually sink. Bodies floated in the waves. Survivors were pulled aboard, shaking, sunburned, covered in oil. Back home, the newspapers celebrated. Morale surged. But the men who fought Midway mostly went silent. They knew what it had cost, and they knew what it had begun. Because Midway didn't end the war. It just turned it like a ship, slowly pivoting in an endless sea. Not with a cheer, with 6 minutes of chaos that no one saw coming.